Afternoon. I want to talk to you about a very important issue, and it's the issue of housing and why Irish people are finding it so difficult to acquire housing and to acquire shelter. Housing, of course, is very important, central to government policy, not just because it provides a basic human need of shelter and protection, but also because it enables people to acquire a meaningful asset that they can hand on to the next generation and give them a certain degree of independence from the state. And traditionally, Irish people have been very high have had a very high level of home ownership compared to Europe. That has now changed significantly. When we joined the European Union, we had approximately 70 to 80% of home ownership in our country. And in fact, we developed as a system of social welfare. The provision of housing was developed in Ireland before so modern social welfare systems were developed. And this was seen as a means of bringing people out of poverty. That figure has now dropped very significantly. We're now slightly above the European average at around 55%. And that figure is dropping. That was the last time I checked. It may have dropped below that. And I suspect that in the younger age cohort, that figure is probably at or below the European average at present. And we have to ask why this has happened. There's a number of policies I'd like to look at. The first is the significant promotion of high density and high rise housing over the last 2 decades in Ireland. And it is seen in many ways as a panacea. If you can promote high density and high rise, then you will be able to build more housing more effectively and solve the housing crisis, which I think every party now recognises is a really serious issue. But the problem with it is that high density housing and apartment housing has a number of significant disadvantages. One is that financial institutions are much less likely to lend on them to the private individual. Many recent studies have shown that the great majority of apartment type developments, particularly in the Dublin area, are being bought not by private individuals but by financial institutions, many of them financial institutions outside the country. The reason being that banks are very reluctant to issue a loan on a single apartment to an individual. They have much less hesitation in issuing a loan to a financial institution, which is seen as white collar, to purchase perhaps 20 or 30 houses as a block. So the policy of high density has tended to facilitate ownership by financial institutions, very often foreign financial institutions. It does not facilitate ownership by Irish individuals. It has another effect, the promotion of high density, and it has an effect on birth rates. People are much more reluctant to have children if they do not have a house with a garden. That is a recognized fact. I have done some original research on this myself, and the impact of high-rise living it significantly affects the number of children that a family will have. That's understandable. People delay having a second or a third child until such time as they can acquire a house, and it may mean that they end up never having that second or third child. So in a strange way, the policy of high density is often justified on the basis of lower family sizes. But I actually think it's one of the causes of lower birth rates in Ireland. Now, one of the results of low birth rate, of course, is the promotion of immigration into the country. Sometimes it is justified on the basis of our own needs, but far more often it is justified on the basis of simply having an open door policy, particularly in regard to asylum seekers and so on and so forth. And we recently have a situation where our Justice Minister has announced an amnesty for what she says is 17,000 illegal immigrants into the country to give them citizenship. Of course, we imagine that figure will be greater than 17,000 when the actual figure is announced. It always is. And we believe that it will not be the first. It will be the first of several amnesties. It will be an ongoing program. So, of course, following policies of that nature is inevitably going to put pressure on the housing market one way or the other. We also see the efforts to change the direct provision system, whereby people will be taken out of direct provision after 4 months and will be guaranteed housing. Now, that again, of course, is going to put significant pressure on the housing market. It's going to put significant pressure on the people who wish to house themselves. The policies pursued by almost all parties of government now place an over-reliance on the provision of public housing and publicly owned housing. This is a good in itself. But that's not what Irish people want. Irish people want to own and acquire their own houses. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's almost treated now as if the desire to own property is an unhealthy offshoot of the past. And we see the phrase from the World Economic Forum, you will own nothing and you will be happy. You'll be happy whether you like it or not. But that's not the way Irish people are. There's very good reasons why people should protect and own private property. The development of Western civilization, the development of the Greek city-state, the development of the legal structures that have been the basis of Western civilization for millennia, are primarily on the basis of not just to protect freedom and liberty and religious worship, but to protect the ownership of property and to enable people to be able to legally and legitimately hand on property to the next generation without excessive interference by the state. That's where Western civilization emanated from. And those who seek to destroy that culture are in fact seeking to destroy the Western culture, which has given us freedom, which has given us security, which has given us prosperity. And by ignoring the importance of private property, they will do just that. Many other of the policies pursued by our government, such as in regard to building regulations, increased levels of insulation, they may be worthy in their own rights. I think they're often promoted as a result of the ideology of global warming, with which I significantly disagree. But I do believe that the housing now being produced is a very fine product in that it has very high levels of insulation, very low heating costs, and these are all very good things. But we have to recognize that promoting those policies has resulted in a significant increase in the cost of housing. And it makes it very, very difficult for a small family, for a young family starting out, to be able to afford a new house. So we've got to, again, intervene in the financial market and see, can we support long-term mortgages? Typically, mortgages used to be 20 to 30 years. Perhaps we should be looking at 60-year mortgages, intergenerational mortgages, to enable people to get on the housing market and to acquire an asset which they can pass on to the next generation. Also, again, touching on the issue of carbon taxes and the drive for zero carbon, we seem to go for zero everything in our country. It is going to make the retention of the existing housing stock very, very difficult. And when people are endeavoring to convert older buildings in villages or in town centres to modern residential use, given that the retail market seems to be disappearing from those areas, they're faced with enormous difficulties in terms of compliance with zero energy requirements. And again, we really have to look at that. We have to look at a sensible approach to the retention of existing buildings, which can be achieved, certainly upgrade insulation levels, but looking for too high a standard can make the conversion of those buildings impossible. So we really do need a comprehensive policy of how such units can be reasonably converted. There are certain other financial matters which government policy has implemented, which have a very negative effect on enabling people to acquire housing. One, of course, is the imposition of VAT on new housing. Can it not be argued that this being a necessary social need, that there should be a VAT holiday for the acquisition of a first-time house for a first-time buyer? Now, many people, of course, argue that when you give a concession like that, or when you give grant aid, it simply has the impact of increasing the cost of housing. But we do have experience, very significant experience, of assessing the cost of housing and issuing certificates of reasonable value. And surely any builder or developer who wishes to avail of a grant aid or a VAT holiday for a first-time buyer should be required, or can be required, to give a certificate of reasonable value, including a 15% profit margin, and that would stop the effect of housing price inflation. These are some of the policies that we have in the Irish Freedom Party. We think they're reasonable policies, and we would ask for your support and to look at the positions taken by our party. I think far too often the other political parties are ideologically driven and they're doing a great deal of damage. Thank you for listening. This has been Michael Leahy.